Chapter 10. The spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the three other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" explained Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But don't we want as big as a start as we possibly can get?" said Peter. "If we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "Oh, that she will," said Mrs. Beaver. "But we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she shall be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now don't you get fussing, dear," said Mrs. Beaver, "but just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Course we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "Oh, that's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we were out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads and the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine is too heavy to bring." "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "A great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose?" "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely as not." "Oh, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll lay her a bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and on the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at it through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pat, 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 pat through the snow in front of her as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired, and she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right, and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then, as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank which had almost been hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing.